and welcome to the IACMR Research Seminar Series. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Eric Zhao. I'm from Indiana University. I just took over from David Zhu as a co-chair of this research seminar series. So I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to serve this community. Now, as you know, IACMR Research Seminar Series is a monthly room-based seminar series for scholars around the world, particularly for faculty and students working in China. So this is a very important initiative, and I believe it adds significant value in democratizing our access to knowledge. And this is especially true for our colleagues in mainland China who have very limited access to the field's greatest scholars. So as a co-chair, I'm hoping to bring you some of the best scholars in strategy, OT, as well as entrepreneurship research, by having them present their work and offering you the opportunity to ask questions and interact them with them directly. I hope all of you will have a very productive and pleasant experience by attending this seminar series, okay? Now, so if you want to be informed of the forthcoming seminars, please feel free to scan these 2 QR codes so that you can receive notifications in the future. One thing to note during the talk is that please keep yourself muted. If you have questions during the talk, please leave your questions in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on the chat box when Mike is presenting his research. And you can also, of course, wait until the very last Q&A session to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly. Okay, now, so today we're extremely delighted and honored to have Professor Michael Lounsbury join us and share with us his most recent thoughts on institutional logics. And Michael is an extremely accomplished scholar and really needs no introduction, right? So you can read all this information here on this slide. One thing I do want to say is that as scholars, we all strive to not just publish in those top journals, but really do something, do some groundbreaking work, right? So be known for some signature research. So a lot of us may never achieve that in our whole career, but Mike has pioneered 2 research streams, one on institutional logics with Pat Thornton and Willa Ocasio, and another one on cultural entrepreneurship with Marian Glenn. So both of which have influenced generations of scholars. So if you're looking for some role models or some inspirations, you should really look no further, okay? Now, so Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take this away whenever you're ready. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for the kind introduction. I will share my screen. Good. Is that good?
Very good.
Okay. It's a delight to be with you all. And if Eric, if there's any kind of pressing questions, I'm happy to take questions as I go along. I know that there's varied background in institutional logics, the topic of the day. So I'm trying to pitch this very broadly, and I'll situate it within sociological institutionalism. And it's going to be kind of a advertisement for a couple of things, but at a very high level. And I'm happy to provide the slides afterwards and point people to readings if they want to get into it a bit more. How I want to start is a bit provocatively, and to say that for me, the institutional logics perspective provides a new way of seeing. In contrast, for instance, to a focus on rational action of individuals and organizations, which dominates much of economics, the logics perspective embraces a social constructionist ontology that focuses on how much social life is culturally constituted. Importantly, shaped by fundamental aspects of society, family, community, religion, the state, etc. So today I'm going to provide a brief overview of how this perspective fits into the sociological institutionalism, tell you a bit about the logics perspective, and then highlight some directions where this literature is going. To start, I want to thank one of my students, Milo Wang, who's on the call somewhere, who helped get the Institutional Logics Perspective book published in China, and the Chinese edition has just come out this year. This is what it looks like. And so it should be easy for folks to pick it up and to learn more about what these ideas are about. I'm going to start with telling you a bit of background of where the perspective came from. And to start, I'm just going to flash back to a pretty famous table in the DiMaggio and Powell edited volume, 1991, where they talk about the old and the new institutionalism. And the old institutionalism in North American style is linked to people like Talcott Parsons, Phil Selznick, Art Stinchcombe. In this tradition, focused a lot on values, that it gets embedded in vested interests, and focuses on conflict that are around those kinds of values. A canonical study would be Phil Selznick's study of TVA in the grassroots, where he focuses on how the values around the initial development of TVA were to help poor farmers through electrification, and how over time, increasingly elites co-opted the TVA and the original values that inspired the development of the TVA were corrupted over time. This focus on values dissipated with the rise of the new institutionalism. When we say the new institutionalism, I'm talking about work in the 70s linked to Meyer and Rowan, DiMaggio and Powell, these kinds of folks. And the big difference from the old to the new is a shift from values to cognition. And so there's a cognitive revolution linked to Herb Simon, the development of the Carnegie School, and a whole shift within the sociology of culture and anthropology that begins focusing on classifications, scripts, schemas, the taken for grantedness of culture, habits, routines. And the new institutionalism focuses much more on how different kinds of practices, kinds of organizations, behaviors become taken for granted and pervasive across different kinds of fields of society. This new institutionalism, and I'm sorry for the busy slide, but I'm happy to provide the slides later. I'm not going to talk through it all. But I want to emphasize that the new institutionalism is what I call a constitutive project. So in contrast to what I started out with in thinking about rational choice that's dominant in economics, new institutionalism began to ask questions about where do actors come from? Where do the interests of actors come from? How do they get constituted by broader societal cultural processes? And if you go back and look at some of the famous works by Meyer and Rowan, Zucker, DiMaggio and Powell, there's a lot of connections back to not only Berger and Luckman and social constructionism, but also ethnomethodology and phenomenology. So we go into Goffman, Garfinkel, Schutz, the German sociology of knowledge tradition. These are very foundational ideas for the new institutionalism. So DiMaggio and Powell's 1991 book really focused on trying to highlight how we needed to bring a lot of ethnomethodology and phenomenology back in, if you look at towards the end of their introduction. This becomes important as I unfold the development of institutionalism and tell you about how I think about logics. World society institutionalism, this is a picture of John Meyer, is a branch of the new institutionalism that stayed very constitutive throughout its development to the current day. And for anyone that knows this literature, they focus a lot on this liberal capitalist democracy that gets promulgated by NGOs, the United Nations, that has spread values and beliefs about the importance of democracy, human rights, et cetera, and how standard forms of North American and European education, for instance, now can be seen throughout the world, through Africa, Asia, et cetera. So the idea is that these different kinds of models become taken for granted and diffused. They become objectified and become the rationalized institutional rules that operate as myths. There's been many studies that have looked at the spread of environmental protection policies, science, education, etc., across the world, focusing on isomorphism. Isomorphism is a standard kind of trope that's associated with the new institutionalism. And throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, this would be a typical characterization of a lot of the research that was going on, which tended to be very large-scale quantitative studies of how different organizational actors in fields or nation states across the world began adopting the same kinds of models, practices, programs, etc. And this became a point of criticism that the new institutionalism was tracking this isomorphism, which really became equated with how everything becomes the same. This led to a number of famous critiques. I wrote a paper in '97 with Paul Hirsch about bringing the old and new institutionalisms together. The idea here is that in the '91 book, where the new institutionalists, DiMaggio and Powell, make this break between the old and the new, many people said there's something about the old that we're missing in this focus on the diffusion and isomorphic processes, particularly around actors, their interests, and how institutional change processes happen. And in fact, a famous quote in the DiMaggio and Powell introduction in 1991 says, they suspect that something has been lost in the shift from the old to the new institutionalism. These kinds of complaints about the old and the new and complaints against isomorphism in the 1990s led to a broad-scale shift in the nature of the kind of research that was done in institutional theory. And here's an image I like to throw up. It's lemmings, which from 10,000 feet looks like isomorphism. They're all jumping off the cliff. But if you zoom in very closely, you notice there's lots of variation in behavior, action. Here it's a comedic kind of grading of the jump into the water, where you could get different scores. And so the 1990s became a pivot point in new institutionalism, where there was a shift from study of isomorphism towards the study of agency, actors, and variation that underlies isomorphism. This, over time, became critiqued because there was a lot of focus on actors. And these folks here, Ho Kyu Hwang, who's in Australia, Jeanette Kalivas and Julie Drury have been writing lots of things lately. They're linked to the Meyer School of Neo-Institutionalism, and they have a recent critique, I think, in AMR, and they have a volume in Research in the Sociology of Organizations that critiques institutional scholarship for celebrating actors and not sticking true to the cultural constitutive approach that was predominant in the 70s and 80s in the new institutional scholarship. And in particular, criticize institutionalists for veering too close to rational choice. And this is exemplified in the 1990s in the literature on institutional entrepreneurship that's often critiqued for glamorizing heroic individuals, as opposed to focusing on practice and the complexity of institutional dynamics. Meyer and Jefferson themselves complained in 2000 that even institutional researchers who claim to be attending to culture and meaning and social constructionism often underplay the highly constructed, scripted, and legitimated character of modern actorhood. This is all becomes important because the institutional logics perspective really emerges in this milieu where institutional theory has shifted towards focusing on actors, but has lost touch with some of the initial foundational ideas that animated early new institutional scholarship, which I would call constitutive institutional scholarship. And what the institutional logics perspective does within this conversation is to highlight how we can have a constitutive approach to behavior, action, individuals, and organizations, and not focus on isomorphism, but focus on the heterogeneous dynamics of socioeconomic life. Here's just a typical definition. I'm sorry, do you still have it? I hit the wrong button. Here's a canonical definition that talks about, that defines institutional logics as socially constructed historical patterns of cultural symbols and material practices, including assumptions, values, and beliefs by which individuals and organizations provide meaning to their daily activity, organize time and space, and reproduce their lives and experiences. And I imagine, I don't see everyone's faces, but when you read it and you hear me read it, your eyes gloss over. And one of the big problems in the institutional logics literature is that for many folks, it's ambiguous and uses kind of language that's very hard for everyone to easily understand. I don't know if I'm going to be able to demystify it today, but it's a critique I'll get to in a minute. What I want to say about this approach, maybe an easy way to think about logics from my perspective is that they are configurations of meanings and practices that are relatively enduring within particular fields of action. We believe, we argue in this 2012 book, the edition that just came out in China, that this perspective provides a new approach to social structure and action that emphasizes the partial autonomy of actors from institutions. And we leverage Anne Swidler's cultural toolkit in talking about how elements of logics can be mixed and matched and change. A key thing here about logics is that it's rooted in practice. So it's not just beliefs, but it's what people are actually doing. So if you want to study logics, you have to study the cultural meanings, but also attend to the practices, the behaviors of people, which is linked to materiality. Material and symbolic dimensions can be understood separately, but they're often intertwined and they become congealed in the context of logics. Logics are thought of as historically contingent and operate at multiple levels of analysis. What is a logic? This is a figure from the book. I encourage you to go look and read more on it if you want to understand what this is. At the heart of the institutional logics perspective is defining an interinstitutional system at the societal level that thinks of different kinds of spheres or what we call institutional orders as having ideal typical logics that fundamentally differ. So the logic of the family often conflicts with certain kinds of religious logics or a state logic, or especially a market logic. Professional logics and corporate logics provide alternative ways of organizing and often conflict within corporations. These different kinds of interinstitutional spheres had been in the literature. What was new in the 2012 book is talking about community as a logic. And by community, we can think of different kinds of geographic communities tethered to cities or towns or regions, but also virtual communities. And these communities can have certain kinds of practices that differentiate themselves from, in the case of a market logic, transnational trade exchange logics, for instance. Each of these logics is comprised of what we call the y-axis elements in these different categories. I won't go through them all, but the idea is that each logic will differ across these various kinds of dimensions. Now, the trick here is that each of these 7 institutional orders don't provide definitive logics. It's an ideal type in sort of the spirit of Weberian research. And so for a market logic, for instance, you could have thousands of different kinds of instantiations of market logics. They wouldn't all be the same. You could have multiple professional logics, multiple market logics. The way the market logic and the state logic look in China will be completely different than if you come to Canada. So there's variation across country and across time. And this becomes very important because it's when we think about what the institutional logics perspective does in shifting away from isomorphism, the argument here is that there's heterogeneity built into society across these different institutional orders. this conflict provides opportunities for novelty, for action, for creativity, for innovation. And within the institutional order, you can create different kinds of variants of market logics and professional logics. Even the state logic can vary, I would suspect, across regions, for instance. That's just a broad overview. Cycling back, there's a famous paper by Friedland and Alford in 1991, I'll mention in a moment. But there was not much on logics research really until after 2000. There's a couple of papers in the late 90s, but the research around this is very contemporary and still developing rapidly. One of the early famous papers is by Havman and Rao in American Journal of Sociology, where they look at the rise of progressivism in the US and show how the rise of progressivism leads to a transformation in the organizational form of savings and loans. It's kind of a what we would call a macro to macro approach that doesn't really go down to the individual or organizational level. It's a shift that happens across a field of action. Another famous paper, Thornton and Ocasio, again, American Journal of Sociology, 1999, look at a shift between a dominant professional logic in higher education publishing to the rise of a market logic. And then they show how this rise of the market logic reshapes the focus of attention and how these organizations are run, and then show that there's a change in how they do executive succession in these organizations. So the nature of the argument is sort of top down. There's a logic change at the field level that then shapes what people are doing inside organizations. They actually get data on decision making within organizations across the field to demonstrate this argument. In the 2012 book, we talk about macro to macro and top down approaches to change in the logics literature, but by the time we wrote this, circa 2010, 2011, there had been many papers in the early 2000s. And what we tried to do here is develop some novel theory about how we think about connecting macro to micro studies. So you can go down to the individual level, organizational level. Logic certainly shape behavior. They shape the focus of attention at the micro level. They shape the identity, goals, and schema of actors, individuals, and organizations. That shapes, again, social interaction, and then can shift identities and practices. And so if you recall the Coleman bathtub of macro to micro to micro to macro, essentially in the book, all the different chapters try to map out these relationships between micro and macro. It's not always necessary to go down to the micro level. There's big conversations about micro foundations, and everyone wants to go to individuals and organizations. In many kinds of arguments, it's perfectly reasonable to have a macro to macro argument. This would be the work of world society institutionalism in the Meyer tradition. So unlike some arguments that think that we need first principles or sort of a fundamental theorization at the individual level, institutionalism in sociology doesn't believe it. It may be sometimes useful to go to the individual level. In my research, I often try to get down to the organizational level and organizational decision makings. And I think that research provides sort of a concreteness to the arguments to be able to show this variation at the organizational level and across individuals. But the theory itself suggests processes that could work in a variety of kinds of ways. Fundamentally, when we think of micro here, it's not individuals with interests, economic interests. For it to be an institutional logics argument, one would hopefully want to see how logics are shaping the nature of what individuals and organizations are doing. And that's the constitutive part that separates the neo-institutionalism. And much of what I highlighted earlier was criticized around institutionalism when people went to institutional entrepreneurship in a rush to the micro to look at actors, a lot of that research over the past couple of decades has missed how the actors are actually constituted by the context, by the beliefs and the practices in which they're embedded. So a logics argument restores that constitutive sensibility. I just want to note, just really briefly, and I could highlight lots of studies because this literature has exploded. There's hundreds of studies. But I just wanted on this slide also to highlight some Chinese scholarship and research on China. And I had this paper with Eric Zhao showing how market and religious logics shape flows of commercial and public capital across MFOs, microfinance organizations, and that was kind of a worldwide diffusion study. Xiaoling Luo has a number of logics papers and has studied a lot on corporate governance logics and how that affects, for instance, foreign direct investment. Zhu and I highlighted how multiple institutional logics based in family and the state affected the nature of democratic elections imposed by the Chinese government in rural villages. And with another student, Mia Reynard, and Royston Greenwood, we showed how government mandated CSR initiatives in China varied by the legacies of logics in the interior of China versus more Western influenced coastal cities. And I highlight this because, and my student Milo is doing a lot of really interesting research on China, and as I'm sure many of you are, this scholarship on logics in China to me is so important and is only scratching the surface. And China is so interesting because it's so different than the massive studies that are in top North American journals. And we need more studies of China and other countries in South America, Africa, across Asia, India, to really understand the nature of how context is shaping the behavior and how these logics work. So I'm encouraging all of you that I think part of the logics agenda is to develop a comparative agenda so we understand these cross-national variations. One of the biggest growth areas within the logics literature over the past decade has been on institutional complexity. I have a paper in the Annals with Royston and some students in 2011 that set an agenda for institutional complexity, which is explicitly looking at how actors like organizations are coping with competing demands of different logics. So it's really a focus on these competing logics and how it puts organizations and decision makers in a very difficult place to have to trade off doing something for one stakeholder while ignoring something from another stakeholder. And there's a lot of research that's been done. I just highlighted a couple of papers here. Badalana and Dorado had a very nice study of creating hybrid organizations. Hybrid organizations is becoming a big theme in the literature. This work of Mike Smets and colleagues on Lloyd's of London, really digging into the mechanisms by which organizations are dealing with these different logics to try to help them to coexist is really important. So people are really zooming in on what actors and organizations are doing to deal with this kind of institutional complexity. Of course, there's a famous study in American Administrative Sociological Quarterly by McPherson and Sauter that look at how different people with different professional backgrounds in a drug court employ different logics as tools in how they negotiate with each other over different kinds of cases that come up in the drug court. This is all kind of really important contemporary work, and yet there's another critique, and there's lots of critiques and growing critiques of the logics literature. And I'll tell you, from the initial time we published that 2012 book, I think Pat, Willie, and I felt that we had we were marked people, that we had an X on our back, and people were taking shots. I guess it's part of developing some ideas that become more popular. But critiques often have some important elements to them that one should take seriously. And I take seriously the point about conceptual ambiguity within the literature. And it's partly the problem because the literature has grown so dramatically. There's so many papers published in all the top journals that it becomes something that people want to use when they theorize. And many of the papers in some of the journals often really don't focus on exploring the logics and what I would say the constitutive nature of logics, how they constitute the nature of actors and their behavior, and often sort of just glom logics onto actors as if they were interest-based arguments. So, and part of this argument is that these logics are tools. And in fact, in the 2012 book, we embraced Swidler's toolkit and talked about logics as tools. But we certainly didn't mean to think of them as objectified things that people could use, or in the McPherson and Sauter paper suggested that people can just grab a professional logic or a religious logic and do what they want in different circumstances. That's not the way these things are. These are much more enduring. They're much more embedded in one's mindset, cognitive categories, values, even though these are collectively shared practices and beliefs. So there's a recent paper I'm going to point you to, and this is with Milo and a couple of colleagues. It just came out in the Annual Review of Sociology, and we talk about new directions in the study of institutional logics. And Milo and I have a different paper where we argue for constitutive institutionalism and lay out the arguments for really using logics in a constitutive fashion and not sort of being forced into a reductive analysis of actors and interests. And so just in this paper, we're taking on the critiques that I just mentioned seriously. Noting in the 2012 book, Pat Willey and I emphasized the complexity of logics, highlighting how logics are comprised of these various kind of y-axis elements. If you remember the table with the y-axis and all the institutional orders, and how these different y-axis elements congeal to form logics. And a logic by definition would for us have to be relatively coherent and durable configurations of meanings and practices. However, we also argue that logics are nearly decomposable, drawing on Herb Simon's famous arguments, or you could think of them as modular. You can mix and match so that various configurations can form logics. So there can be many kinds of market or community logics, or different hybrid logics that combine professional and corporate logics, for instance. Roger Friedland has a famous critique of our book in 2012, where he argues that the more decomposable these things are, the less they can be argued to exist. And he asks, how coherent and durable must a logic be to be a logic? That is the fundamental question that we try to raise in this paper and try to theorize and provide an answer for. Because in fact, the literature has said very little about the boundary conditions on the coherence and durability of logics. Certainly, we don't believe they're static. We believe they change gradually, but there's an enduring nature of them, or they're not a logic. Not everything is a logic. The issue is important and requires a systematic research agenda on, we think, the identification of logics and their orders, as well as how they emerge, are maintained, change, and dissipate. In this paper, we highlight and discuss 3 areas of focus. I'm going to mention them just briefly. These include unpacking the role of values. And remember, values was something that was lost from the shift from the old to the new institutionalism, the centrality of practice, and the governance of institutional logics. On values, and the key thing here is that we can't go back to the 1950s version of values that we find in Parsons and Selznick. Scholarship in sociology, in the sociology of culture, and within the logics literature is, and in the practice literature, is trying to theorize values as something that's collectively shared. Certainly, it's something that comes to be inside of us through different kinds of commitments, but it's not through socialization and individual action that we have individual values. We have values that are linked to a shared experience in practice and in shared meanings. I won't read this slide again, but Friedland has tried to theorize this in ways that are difficult for me to understand, talking about what he calls substances. And this goes back to Aristotle's notion of substance. And he's talking about non-phenomenal teleontology. Roger Friedland is someone that has studied religion a lot, and religion becomes an analogy for all logics for him. So a market logic is equally as religious as a Confucian logic to Friedland. Another kind of concept that's come up by Voronov and Weber are to think about ethos as the set of collectively shared values or ideals that imbue orders with transcendental, quasi-religious, and profound qualities. A quote from their paper. So I just point to this because people are thinking about it, and values is increasingly cropping up in the journals again. But we need to be careful about what we're doing with values. We're not going back to the way values used to be. We're trying to conceptualize a new form of values that's consistent with the ontology presented here in logics. We think about practice. Practice is absolutely central to logics and distinguishes it from other kinds of approaches to culture. So again, logics are defined by configurations of meanings and practices, and for research on logics, I've argued, many people have argued, that we need much more attention to the level of practice. And there's a lot of interaction now with practice theorists. So I just point you to this. Practice theorists have a pretty distinctive community. It's a very prominent form of theorizing in Europe. And I think that there's a lot we can learn from studying practice in that sort of way. I just want to note that this comes from the book and other research I've done. When we think of practices and meanings as congealing in the form of logics, when we can study practice, studying practice gives us a way to understand how logics may change in ways that are completely unintentional. Because in the normal use of practice within a field, think about someone on a bunch of workers in a manufacturing plant, and supposedly all doing the same kind of work, but certain people will do different kinds of things. They'll have a way of doing the work that varies slightly, either by accident, or it may be easier for them, or they see some sort of way to innovate. It may be intentional, it may be unintentional, but that variation can provide a dynamic that can lead to a change in the behaviors across a whole system, across a factory floor and across an industry. And it's through this practice change that you can actually get a transformation of logics and the beliefs associated with logics. And it's part of the literature that has been relatively unattended to, and we need much more attention to very fine-grained, what I would call ethnographic kinds of studies of practices to unpack the dynamics of logics and practice. Finally, and I just want to make sure we save time for some questions and interaction, I want to highlight the importance of governance. And governance is something that is very apparent in those of you that are more attuned to the political science and economic institutionalism, certainly in the IB literature and elsewhere. But governance has been something that's not been as prominent in the new institutionalism in sociology from DiMaggio and Powell forward. And I think governance is a super important topic, and I think may provide an opportunity for sociological institutionalism to connect more deeply with political and economic strands of institutional analysis. In the 2012 book, we actually define institutional order as governance systems that provide a frame of reference that precondition actors' sense-making choices. We say that, but we don't lay out an agenda to study governance in that book. I think a focus on governance is especially useful because it can redirect attention away from these logics as tools to study how various kinds of actors at a broader scale are trying to help these logics to cohere, to maintain them as logics. They may resist change, but certainly they're actively involved in maintaining the coherence and durability of logics. So what do I mean by these actors? Just as an example, I would say that research on governance implies the study of what I would call command posts. So nation states, varied governmental agencies, the military, international governing bodies, United Nations, World Bank, IMF, but also professional elites, bureaucratic staffers, associations, NGOs, that all have an interest in some jurisdiction over some sort of policy. There can be conflict and debate, but their job is to govern a field, or what some might call an epistemic community. And so it's these jurisdictional battles and maintaining the jurisdiction of logics that keep a certain kind of market logic, I would say, authentic. While much of the staffing of bureaucratic offices is with technocrats, they comprise a crucial group of varied elites and experts that shape organizational life. So I think there's a bigger need to study elites, expertise, higher education, people with higher education degrees of all sorts that are in the position of theorizing how things are supposed to occur within firms, within industries, within policy. For instance, innovation and entrepreneurship as a policy arena. So basic point that we argue in this paper is that how the coherence and durability of institutional orders are themselves achieved through efforts to maintain some sort of commonality in the various instantiations of logics associated with an order across time and space. That is, the people and organizations that are in charge of jurisdictions to maintain the coherence of whatever they've set out to do. And these kinds of beliefs and practices associated with an institutional order are very durable, and these elites and experts make them durable through their actions, but we don't know a lot about how that happens. So just concluding thoughts to open it up for discussion. How I see the institutional logics perspective is kind of really going against the grain of a lot of contemporary new institutional research to come back to the original constitutive orientation of Meyer and Rowan. So John Meyer is someone I talk to a lot, and I think that there's lots of sympathy between the Meyer world institutionalism and institutional logics. Institutional logics redirects attention to heterogeneity of actors and their values, as opposed to isomorphism, which means we can get back to conflict politics and especially governance. And my big plug is to study governance in local communities, nation states, worldwide. And just to get back to a point I made earlier, we need to do this comparatively, and we need lots more research in all sorts of different kinds of countries, but also comparisons between countries, what's similar, what's different. And that's the kind of research I think the logics perspective can help us with. And happy to engage in any kind of debate or dialogue. I think I stuck to 45 minutes, Eric.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. That's awesome. That's great. And you know, I think somebody is okay. All right, thank you so much for keeping yourself muted. Of course, now it's time for you to unmute yourself if you have any questions. Mike, by the way, I think this is great talk. It's thank you so much for providing this very rich content. And I'm sure, a lot of the students and faculty here will benefit from seeing your slides if you're happy to share them.
I'm happy to share the slides, and I can, anyone who's interested, I can turn you on to the literature as well and point you to things to read. The literature is very vast, but there's
right
papers I can give you good overviews.
Yeah, exactly. I think the thing is, I felt myself I was pretty, knowledgeable regarding logics when I was a student back in Alberta. Now I feel like I'm lagging behind. So there's a lot happened in the past 10 years. So I think, one challenge I can see is for this audience is like there's a lot to sink in, right, to catch up. So if for doctor, student, junior faculty, if they're trying to catch up on this literature, what would be the best starting point from your perspective?
Well, I would start with the book, which the Chinese translation is out, and I would read that. And if people were confused by anything that was there, I'm happy to respond to emails from folks if there's questions. And that's where I would start. Once you get there, then there's a couple of key empirical papers, and I can just kind of put this in an email that you can send out. But I think our recent ARS paper is a good place to get kind of a contemporary understanding of what the current debates are.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you so much, Mike. So, and of course, I see there's some questions coming in, but I do have a question for you before that. So, of course, congratulations on this Chinese edition of the book. I think definitely that'll be very useful for this audience for them to pick it up. And you also highlighted some of the studies done by Chinese scholars, right? You have a slide listed those studies, including the study you and me did, right? So on microfinance organizations, I think that's very helpful. So just to make things a little bit more concrete, so what do you think are the most useful and relevant information and insights that Chinese scholars can pick up from the book? And then, of course, conversely, I know you're not an expert on China, right? So you're not China scholar, but how do you think by leveraging this Chinese context, Chinese scholars could potentially contribute back to extending and also expanding the scope of the institutional logics perspective? Any thoughts on that?
Well, just really briefly, the book provides a very broad overview of the logics perspective and situates it within institutionalism. So in a sense, the book kind of unpacks a lot of the front end of this talk. So would just provide a lot more depth and citations to read. You're not going to read the book and understand it all. One would have to go through a journey where you have to engage the literature more deeply. But the book is a really good starting point to have that overview and then get pointed to different aspects of the literature, for instance, complexity. But also, I believe that it has wide resonance with a lot of different theories. And an important point I want to make is that most of the empirical papers that contribute are interacting logics with other perspectives, whether it's resource dependence, whether it's Carnegie School, other kinds of theories. And so it's the way we describe it is a meta theory. It's a useful kind of guidepost to direct attention, but in actually developing a social scientific explanation of whatever you're looking at, it often needs to be combined with other kinds of theories to develop that explanation. And so we sort of point that out and connect it to different kinds of theories in the book, especially in the chapter on micro foundations, which connects to sense making, identity, social movements. So it's really endless. As far as Chinese scholarship, as someone that doesn't know China that well, and in fact has not been there yet, I've now worked with a few students that are Chinese, and every time I talk to you, I learn new things. I think the world still knows very little about what's happening in China, and there's a lot of studies that use available data, but there's not a lot of data. We need more in-depth studies of China by Chinese scholars that help the rest of the world understand various kinds of dynamics and how the context works. So I see a question here about Chinese Confucianism. The logics literature would not tell you anything about it because we need empirical studies of it. What the logics literature does is provide kind of a broad theoretical framework to help think about how you could study that. But we actually need the research and really deep contextualized research on how, for instance, Chinese Confucianism works and how it shapes behavior in particular kinds of contexts. And can we find a context where Confucianism conflicts with a market logic and how that's resolved? So I could go on a lot, but I see many sorts of questions. We just need a lot more research. I think we know, me as someone that's an outsider, you all may know it. But given the existing literature, I think we know very little. People that are outside.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, definitely a lot of opportunities for us moving forward. So we do have a lot more questions coming up. So I think the first question I see here is, could you give us some suggestions on how to contextualize logics theory, like define different types of state logics in the Chinese context? So I think this is a pretty useful question, right? So because a lot of times as writers, when we write papers, we always get a challenge from reviewers saying that everything is logic, right? So how we can really clearly define what we mean by logic in a specific context, what kind of steps we can take, right? So to really convince reviewers and readers that what we're studying is really logic, right? So really embedded in this specific context.
So I think it's a great question. And again, I probably will have a naive answer because I don't know the Chinese context as well as I need to. But certainly most people outside of China think that there is one big authoritarian state. And if I've begun to learn something about China, is that while the arm of the state is very long and strong, there is a lot of variety across the country, across the regions and down to the local level. And I don't necessarily want to talk about every little variation in China as a logic. That's not the way I would think about it. I think there very clearly is a state logic that is very potent and powerful. And I would draw on the arguments around governance to really understand what the limits are of the strength and the length of that authoritarian state and how local people can work around. So what does governance look like? Where is the central state the strongest? Where does it ease back a bit? And how do we get variation? So there's been, of course, over the past couple of decades, many studies of a shift from state-owned enterprises to entrepreneurial enterprises and entrepreneurs. That's a start, but we need to know much more focused really on the state and the changing nature of the state. Is the governance of China as a whole the same today as it was 20 years ago? How is it changing? How much more discretion do local politicians have? So I would think about it as studying governance dynamics within a logic.
Mhm. Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. So I think Shuping, you have a question. Are you still here, Shuping? Do you want to ask the question yourself, or you want me to ask the question on your behalf?
So I'm interested in your comments on the micro-foundation movement of institutional theory. So we all know that in strategy, there's this micro-foundation movement. And I think in 2021, in research in the sociology of organizations volume, there are some debates about the micro-foundations of institutional theory. So I wonder, what's your view on this movement? What should be further studied in that direction?
Thanks for the question. I'm someone that hates the term micro foundations, and I think sort of the rush to micro foundations has been not to criticize everything that's going on with micro foundations, but sort of the growing attention to this conversation of micro foundations has led a lot of institutional research, or research that claims to be institutional, to not actually study institutions. They're studying actors and things that people and organizations are doing, and so that's one critique. There's a lot of smart stuff that's within that literature. One of my pushbacks when we did the Alberta Institutions Conference 4 years ago now was to talk about the role of the macro processes. So if one wants to emphasize micro, we can talk about macro. In the end, for me, and what logics does is talk about this fundamental intertwinement between micro and macro, and sort of the co-constitution of institutions and actors. And if research is not engaging seriously in how the institutional context is shaping the range of possibilities of what people can do, it's going astray. For me, micro foundations, and we have this chapter on micro foundations in the logics book, is to show that constitution of actors, but also the constitution of their identities, shaping what they attend to cognitively, shaping the sense-making processes. Of course, there's all sorts of variety of what people do on the ground, but there's limits. And institutions shape what the limits are, and also what the range of solutions can be to a particular problem. So if it's going to be institutional research, it can do micro foundations, but if it wants to claim institutional, the institutions have to be central to what the study is doing.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you so much, Mike. So I think there's one question which is very good. That's the one question that's one comment I mentioned at the very beginning when I had the conversation with you before we started the session. So Wang Ling asked, what are the similarities and differences between institutional logics and the institutional perspective by Mike Peng? So essentially, like I said, a lot of Chinese scholars, when they use institutional theory, they're highly influenced by those guys in international business, their take on institutional theory. So, if you could share some of your thoughts on this, what are the key differences and what are the new insights we can gather by taking on this institutional logics perspective? That'll be very useful.
Yeah. No, thanks. And I'll say that, just to reemphasize the point that I think there's opportunities to connect the literatures, but I have not worked through it myself. But any kind of logics, almost I would claim provocatively, almost all logics papers, empirical papers that are published, rely on other kinds of theories in combination with the logics perspective to provide an explanation. So that theory should be no different. We should be able to connect it. The big difference for me, and especially having talked with some of those folks, is they have a very different and what I would call thin notion of culture. And so it's a more economic perspective. And what really differentiates the new institutionalism broadly and the institutional logics perspective is that it really engages kind of a sociology of culture and cultural studies in a much deeper way. And going back to Geertz, understanding people, actors as embedded in these webs of meaning. And so the studying of the meanings and the practices becomes really paramount in the logics literature. And culture in that world of institutional economics and IB tends to be reified at the nation state or organization. And so we just think about culture differently. And so that's the conversation that would have to be had ontologically to figure out how we might connect these theoretical thought worlds in a more fruitful way.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. So I think we have a lot of questions. Thank you so much for asking all these great questions. I'm browsing through them. I'm going to pick some of this to ask Mike, but it doesn't mean like your question is not important. Okay, so I saw like a question by Shipeng. Mike, you know Shipeng maybe? Shipeng himself has done some very interesting research on logics, right? So in cross-national settings, in some ways it's pretty consistent with with my. Sorry,
I was just going to say it's path breaking.
Yeah, path breaking. Yes.
Everybody should read it.
Yeah. So I think in a lot of ways it's very consistent with the approach I took myself as well, right? So especially at the very beginning, a lot of my effort was on how to quantify logics, right? So I saw actually more than one question here is about how we can really quantify logics, right? So how we can really measure logics. I think this become especially important, when we introduce the whole idea of, we should think about the coherence, we should think about the durability of logics. Can you address this? And also maybe Shipeng, can you ask the question yourself if I didn't capture it 100%?
Sure. Hi, Mike. Hi, Eric. Great to see you here. So thank you for delivering the really great talk. I got inspired. I do want to, because I think given the scope of the talk, you wouldn't have the opportunity to talk about the more methodological approaches to logics research. I think has been, the earlier 1999 Thought on Ocasio paper, they look at, based on the setting, we know there's a shift in the logics. Some people start to count the logics in McSander. The 2013 paper you have reference to. My own work, I've been looking at if we can measure logics in different ways, or even decomposing logic different dimensions and measuring them differently. But I think given the rise of new data, whether we call it big data, small data, or new methods rising up, experiments or machine learning, all sorts of different things. I just wonder if you could comment on that. What do you see as the most promising from your point of view that are, especially for young scholars to pick up on? Second part is slightly different. I wonder if you can comment on how logic can also inform teaching and education. Because I feel that in my own teaching, I teach strategy, I teach corporate social responsibility. I can bring in some of the insights based on the logic's perspective, and some of them are very insightful. At the same time, I feel there's a greater potential hasn't been fully utilized. So I know these are two very broad questions. If you can just provide any kind of thoughts, that would be really appreciated.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good to see you. And maybe we should write a method piece together.
That would be great.
I have lots of thoughts on this. I'll just mention briefly. There's a paper I can point everyone to by Roger Friedland and John Moore, who recently passed away, that studies the logic of love. And they use correspondence analysis with survey data to really show the congealing of meanings and practices, sexual practices in their case. I think that there's lots we can do in that realm using relational analysis, network methods, with data in creative ways to understand the relational connections that tether these meanings and practices. Coming to big data, that's the big opportunity, and we have lots of folks here doing topic modeling and exploring big data and AI in various kinds of ways. And I think that there's big opportunities to sort of construct our own algorithms, to scrape data, to analyze in a particular way. I haven't yet seen, maybe I've missed one, how topic modeling can be used to study logics. I'm talking with folks here about how to do that. That's I think this is the frontier. These methods are developing rapidly. They're working their way into the journals. How can we leverage these new methods or modalities to think about logics? I don't think a topic would tell us what a logic is, but certainly the hanging together of different kinds of topics might. And so anyway, I'm very excited about that. I think we need to somebody needs to write something on that. So if you have an interest, we should explore that. On informing teaching, like this stuff is in my brain, and like it comes out in how I teach, but I don't really like use the literature per se with MBA students, or but for me, it's the sensibility. And it goes back to Friedland and Alfred, that 1991 paper in the Orange Book, DiMaggio and Powell. The headline was "Bringing Society Back In," and so it's sort of an argument against any analysis that zooms in to the organization, the corporation, the particular local conflict, without situating it within a broader context. And it just seems the whole world is becoming much more interested in not only CSR, equity, diversity, inclusiveness, thinking about the community. The pandemic has made the world think about the importance of community and everyone doing something together. And so for me, logics points to this collective structuring of action. In a broad sense. And so it's in that way, I think, in all our teaching, to the extent that we can always bring specific examples to a broader level, it gives people a way to think more critically and broadly about a problem.
That's a great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaban, for asking this great question. Okay, good to see you. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I see Joanna here. Joanna asked a question. Joanna, are you here?
Yeah. Hi, Eric. Mike, thank you for this presentation. I have one question that in recent days, especially after the pandemic started, we have seen a lot of movements, activities in the society, and also there has been increasing interest for management scholars to attend to the problem. So I wonder, I noticed there was a book chapter that you wrote in 2017 where you talk about the movements and logics, but I wonder, because I haven't dive very deep into this, so I wonder if you could provide some suggestions for future research direction, or you think there might be opportunities for this line of research. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So movements and logics. Yeah, the movements literature is another literature close to my heart, and I think where it comes together, it would, for me, would connect back to the role of values and governance and practice, because how I think about logic change, well, a key part of logic change is collective action of various sorts. And in fact, I think governance is collective action. And if we, and not only is governance a form of collective action, governance is a form of kind of elite activity around logics that is reacting to all sorts of other movements, whether they're local or cross-local. So one of the things I'd like to see, and in that 2017 paper, we lay out a variety of research directions, but I think a new one is to really study these governance processes and how governance actors are responding to different kinds of claims or actions by movements, different aspects of movements. That's what I would push us towards. So, for instance, in the context of things that are happening in China, I would hope to see studies that are really unpacking kind of the Hong Kong situation and kind of people uprising and how that's interacting with governance in a way that is perhaps changing. So again, like in that context, that's a movement against, let's say, a state logic, or there's sort of intervention by a governance actor, that's a set of actors that are influenced by the state logic. Does this movement have any effect in changing the nature of that governance? Does the movement just get crushed, or is there kind of an interactive dynamic that's going on that leads Hong Kong to a different place? And so it's that kind of interaction between movement and governance, to think of it as a process that leads to reformation, that could be very fruitful from the standpoint of logics and governance.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, thank you so much, Mike, for sharing this ideas. So as you can see from the chat box, there's a lot of faculty students asking you for your slides. So I'm sure you're going to share slides with me, and then we are going to distribute the slides through the IACMR platform.
Okay.
So that everybody can benefit from reading the slides more closely. All right.
Sounds good. And people can feel free to email me. I'm happy to e-dialogue with questions and turn you on.
Sure. Yeah. And also, Wei, are you here? So if you are here, please make sure we save. Of course, we're recording this whole session, but also please also save the chat history if you could, so that we can gather all these different questions. We can pass over to Mike. Mike, you don't feel pressured to respond to every single one of these questions, but at least you get an idea, what this Chinese audience have in mind when they try to engage the logics perspective, what kind of puzzles they have, right? So whenever you get a chance, to talk more about logics to this audience, that can provide some insights. All right.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to hopefully seeing everybody sometime in this life.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for spending time with us, Mike. Yeah. And I really appreciate your time, your sharing. And I'm sure, we'll keep in touch. And, as we can see, logics perspective is still pretty live and vibrant with a lot of opportunities. So I encourage all of you to, start thinking about this and see whether you can connect your own ideas to this super powerful perspective in the future. Okay. All right. So just for a quick announcement. So after Mike's talk, the next talk on the macro side is by David Zhu from Arizona State University in October. And then right after that, we'll have Cassie Eisenhardt from Stanford to join us, okay, for December. So we have a pretty good lineup for the rest of the year, and really look forward to seeing many of you coming back and engaging in a very productive conversation. Thank you so much for coming. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah.